He thought she was just another suspicious visitor, but in reality, she was an FBI tactical commander who'd been disarming armed men her entire career. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when Imani Caldwell turned her sedan onto Brookhaven Drive in Plano, Texas. The familiar curve of the road felt comforting, the kind of street where kids still rode bikes in the evenings and neighbors waved from their lawns. She hadn't been back in months. Her parents had been calling her for weeks to come home for a proper dinner, and tonight she'd finally cleared her schedule. She slowed as her parents' brick front house came into view, the porch light already on. Pulling into the driveway, she was reaching for her overnight bag when a dark grey SUV rolled up behind her, headlights glaring in the mirror. She squinted, trying to make out the driver, but the glare made it impossible. The SUV didn't just pause. It lurched forward until the front bumper nearly touched hers. A spotlight flicked on, flooding her car with blinding white light. The driver's door swung open. A man in a tactical-style polo stepped out, one hand resting on his belt where a bulky holster hung. He had the kind of walk that wasn't fast, but carried the intent of someone who believed he owned the ground beneath him. "Evening!" he called out, though his tone carried no warmth. "What's your business here?" Imani blinked against the light. "This is my parents' home," she replied, raising her voice just enough to be heard. "I'm here visiting." He took another step forward. "Name?" She hesitated, partly because she didn't feel like playing 20 questions in her own driveway, partly because she was trying to figure out who exactly this guy was. "Who are you?" she asked instead. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "Brent Halverson, HOA Security." He said it like it should mean something. "This neighborhood's had break-ins lately. You match the description we were given." Imani stared at him. "And what description is that?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he flicked his gaze toward her hands, then her face, scanning her like she was an item on a checklist. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Her parents' porch light flickered as the front door opened. She could see her mother, Vivian, step out, confusion etched on her face. "Imani, what's going on?" Imani kept her voice even. "Apparently, HOA Security thinks I don't belong here." Vivian's voice sharpened. "She's my daughter. She grew up here." But Halverson didn't take his eyes off Imani. "Ma'am, I'll need to verify that," he said, his words slow and deliberate. Something about the way he squared his stance told Imani this wasn't about neighborhood safety. She'd dealt with men like this before, in training scenarios, on tactical operations, and occasionally in real life. Men who started at authority and went straight to control without ever touching respect. Her father, Clarence, appeared at the doorway now, stepping down onto the walkway. "Sir, you're making a mistake." Halverson's jaw tightened. "Mistake or not, I have a job to do. Break-ins, suspicious individuals. You'd thank me if it were your property on the line." "I am on my property," Clarence shot back, his voice rising. Imani could feel the air getting heavier, like the moment before a summer storm when you know lightning is coming. But she stayed still, her hands visible, her mind already cataloguing the situation, distance between them, position of his holster, the fact that the SUV engine was still running. She knew she could end this in 30 seconds if she wanted to, but ending it without making the evening headlines would take more care. Halverson's spotlight stayed locked on her. "Step out, now." Vivian started to walk down the driveway toward them. "Brent, you need to back off," she said, using his name like she'd known him for years. Maybe she had. Small towns, even in the suburbs, had long memories. Halverson turned his head slightly toward her, but didn't lower his voice. "Mrs. Caldwell, I'm trying to protect the neighborhood, but your daughter needs to cooperate." Imani finally opened her door and stepped out. Slow, deliberate. She was taller than he expected. She saw it in the flicker of his eyes. She didn't move closer, but her presence shifted the air between them. "Let me make this real clear," she said, her voice low but steady. "You're pointing a light in my face, blocking my car in my parents' driveway, and asking me for ID without cause. That's not security work. That's harassment." Halverson's hand moved closer to the grip of his holstered gun. Clarence took a step forward, but Imani lifted a hand toward him without looking away from Halverson. "Dad, it's fine," she said, though her tone said the opposite. Halverson's voice was almost a growl now. "I'll ask one more time." But before he could finish, a neighbor 2 houses down shouted, "Hey, Brent, that's Clarence's daughter! Back off, man!" The interruption made him hesitate, but only for a breath. And that breath was all Imani needed to know, exactly how this was going to go. But the real escalation hadn't even started yet, and what happened next would pull the entire neighborhood into a confrontation none of them would forget. The sound of the neighbor's voice hung in the air like a pause button that nobody pressed. Halverson didn't back away, but his eyes darted toward the source. The break in his focus gave Imani the chance to take a subtle half-step toward the side of her car, angling herself so she could see both him and her parents. Clarence's shoulders were tight. Vivian's hands were clenched at her sides. The neighbor, Paul Whitman, had stepped out onto his lawn, arms folded like he was ready to make this his business, whether Halverson liked it or not. "Paul," Halverson called back, his voice cutting through the evening air. "Mind your own business." "This is my business," Paul replied, stepping closer. "You're blocking a resident in her own driveway." Imani kept her eyes on Halverson. "Look, I'm not here to make trouble," she said. "I came to see my parents. That's it. You've been told who I am by 2 people who live here. That should be the end of it." Halverson shook his head slowly. "Not until I see ID." Her tone cooled another degree. "You don't have the legal authority to demand it, and unless you're deputized, you're not law enforcement." He smirked, the kind of expression that said, "I've done this before, and no one stopped me yet. Lady, you think because you've got an answer for everything, I'm just going to walk away." Clarence took a step down the driveway, his voice firm. "You're on my property now, Brent. Unless you've got a warrant or a badge, you need to leave." Instead of backing off, Halverson planted his feet. "I'm under contract with the HOA. I have full authority to investigate suspicious activity in the community." Vivian let out a humorless laugh. "Suspicious activity? My daughter coming home with an overnight bag? That's not what it looks like from my side," Halverson shot back. Imani's patience was thinning, but she kept her tone measured. "Then maybe your side is wrong." She stepped just enough to the left that the spotlight wasn't blinding her directly anymore. "What exactly made me suspicious, Brent?" For a moment, his mouth opened like he had an answer ready, but no words came out. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward her car. "You pulled in quick. Didn't see your plate on the resident list." "My parents' names are on that list," she countered. "That's all you need." Paul was closer now, hands still tucked under his arms. "Brent, you're looking for trouble," he warned, "and if you're not careful, you're gonna find it." That seemed to light a fuse. Halverson's right hand rested more firmly on his holster, thumb sliding against the retention strap. Imani saw the micro-movements, the kind that signaled readiness, or an intention to intimidate. Clarence noticed it too. "Don't you put your hand on that gun," he said sharply. Halverson's gaze flickered, but he didn't remove his hand. "Ma'am, sir, I'm giving her one last chance to comply before I call for backup." Imani's brows lifted slightly. "Backup? You mean the other guy in a golf cart who drives around once a week?" Vivian almost smiled, but the tension in the air was too thick for humor to break through. "Brent, this has gone far enough," she said, her voice shaking now, a mix of anger and fear. Paul chimed in again. "She's family here. You're trespassing. Walk away." Halverson's jaw shifted, his eyes moving between all 3 of them. Imani, her parents, and Paul. But every second that passed made his position harder to defend. His ego was in the driver's seat now, and Imani knew it. "Fine," Halverson said finally. "I'll log this as a refusal to comply. The board can handle it." He turned halfway toward his SUV. Imani thought maybe that was the end, but then he stopped, half-turned back, and pointed at her. "Don't think this is over." The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. A challenge. "Neither should you," she replied evenly. He climbed back into the SUV and reversed slowly, keeping his headlights trained on her until he turned down the street. Clarence exhaled. "We should call the police." "Already planning to," Imani said. "But first, I'm going to call someone who can make sure this gets handled properly." Vivian stepped closer to her daughter. "Handled properly?" Imani gave a faint smile. "Let's just say, I've dealt with people like Brent before, and this time, He picked the wrong driveway. Paul shook his head as he walked back toward his house. "I'll be ready to give a statement," he called over his shoulder. "This neighborhood's been going downhill since the HOA brought those guys in." Clarence looked at Imani. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm fine," she said. But he's not. But Halverson wasn't done. And the next move he made would turn this from an argument into something far more dangerous. 15 minutes later, the neighborhood's usual calm had given way to the low murmur of conversation and the glow of porch lights clicking on. Imani stood in the driveway with her parents, still deciding whether to wait for the police or head inside to call her FBI contacts directly. That's when the SUV came back. It rounded the corner slowly, headlights cutting across the street, the sound of its tires louder than it needed to be. Brent Halverson parked diagonally in front of the Caldwell driveway this time, blocking not just her car but the entire street. Clarence's jaw dropped. "What now?" Halverson stepped out, this time holding a clipboard in one hand. "Need to finish my report," he said flatly, as if he hadn't just threatened her minutes ago. Imani didn't move. "You could have finished it from anywhere else." He ignored her, flipping the top page. "Name, date of birth, current address." She stared at him. "You're really trying this again?" His voice sharpened. "You refused to comply. That's suspicious behavior in itself." Paul Whitman reappeared at the edge of his yard, phone in hand. "I told you, Brent. She's a resident's daughter. You're pushing this." Halverson glanced at Paul. "And I told you to stay out of it." Vivian stepped forward, voice raised now. "Brent, I've lived here for 22 years. I've paid HOA fees every month without missing a single payment. And you've never once pulled something like this on any of my other guests." Halverson's tone was condescending. "Mrs. Caldwell, if you have a problem with HOA policy, take it to the board. I'm just enforcing the rules." Imani's patience was burning down to a stub. "Which rule says you can block someone's car and demand their personal information without probable cause?" He didn't answer, just kept writing. Then, without warning, his other hand dropped to rest fully on his holstered firearm. Vivian froze mid-step. "Brent, what are you doing?" "Officer safety," he said, as if the phrase explained everything. Imani's voice dropped into the even, controlled tone she used in tactical briefings. "You're not an officer, and if you touch that gun, you'd better have a reason you can defend in court." Clarence stepped forward, but Imani gave him the same subtle hand signal she used with her FBI team when she needed them to hold position. "Dad, stay put." Halverson's eyes narrowed. "So you're going to keep acting like you're the one in charge here?" She took a slow step forward, closing some of the distance. "I'm acting like someone who knows the law better than you do." From across the street, another porch light clicked on. A neighbor in a bathrobe stood on her lawn, arms crossed. "What's going on out here?" she called. Paul answered for everyone. "Brent's playing cowboy again." The neighbor muttered something under her breath and went back inside, but her door stayed open. Halverson's breathing had shifted, just enough for Imani to notice. Faster, uneven. His posture was less about protocol now and more about ego. Imani kept her hands visible, palms slightly out. "If you're feeling threatened, step back. No one here is a danger to you. You've been told 3 times who I am." He snorted. "Yeah? And who exactly are you, Miss Caldwell?" Vivian looked at her daughter, knowing that this was the moment she'd either tell him or keep playing it close. "I'm someone who's been trained to take a firearm from a man your size in less than 2 seconds without anyone getting hurt," she said plainly. "And I'm giving you the chance to step away before I have to prove it." Paul's eyebrows shot up. Clarence's shoulders eased slightly. He'd seen that tone before, when Imani talked about her work without naming names. Halverson's smirk faltered, just for a second. "What are you, some kind of cop?" "Not exactly," she said. "But let's just say, I've spent my career handling situations a lot hotter than this." He took another step toward her, closing the gap, hand still near his gun. "Then you should know not to threaten security personnel." Her eyes didn't leave his. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you that you're seconds away from making the worst professional mistake of your life." The air felt heavier again, the way it does right before something breaks. Paul's voice cut in sharply. "Police are on their way, Brent. I called them." That made Halverson pause. His eyes flicked toward Paul, then back to Imani. He seemed to be calculating. Fight or back down? But his pride wasn't going to let him back down. Not yet. I'm not going anywhere, he said finally, planting his feet. We'll settle this right here. But Halvorsen was about to learn that settling it right here meant stepping into a fight he couldn't win, because Imani had no intention of letting him control the next move. Halvorsen's stance said everything. Feet wide, shoulders squared, jaw tight. It was the kind of posture that dared someone to challenge him. Imani had seen it before, in warehouses, alleys, and high-risk raids. The difference was, those men usually knew what they were getting into. Halvorsen didn't. She studied him for a moment, silent, the way a chess player sizes up an opponent before taking the next piece. The porch light glinted off the edge of his holster. He was steady, but not steady enough. His right knee had the slightest bend, ready for movement, but it also gave away his dominant side. Small details, invisible to most, but to Imani, they were a flashing neon sign. Clarence's voice broke the tension. Imani, let's just go inside. She didn't turn her head. I will. Soon. Halvorsen's lips curved into a half smirk. See, this is the problem. You think you run things here. No, she replied, voice even. I know who does. She took a step closer, just enough for her voice to drop so only he could hear. And it's not you. That made him flinch. Subtle, but there. Big words for someone in your position, he said. You have no idea what my position is, she said. Her tone was calm, but her eyes were locked in. You see a woman in jeans and a hoodie, pulling into a driveway. What you don't see is the 10 years I spent in the field, or the number of times I've had a gun pointed at me by someone who thought they were in control. He let out a short laugh, but it sounded hollow. So what, you're FBI? She didn't answer right away. Letting silence hang was another skill she'd learned. People fill silence with their own assumptions. He leaned back slightly, as if waiting for her to deny it. Vivian's voice cut through the night. Brent, you've crossed the line. Step away from my daughter. But Halvorsen ignored her. If you were FBI, you wouldn't be standing here playing games. Imani's eyes stayed locked on his. You sure about that? Something shifted then. Maybe it was the tone. Maybe it was the fact that she hadn't flinched once. He looked her over again, slower this time, and she could see the doubt creeping in. Let me tell you how this works, she said, her voice dropping into a low, deliberate rhythm. If I were just a visitor, you'd be looking at a trespassing complaint at best. But I'm not, which means when I report this, and I will report this, it doesn't just go to your HOA board, it goes federal. And every second you stand here is another line you cross. Paul, still a few feet away, whistled under his breath. She's not bluffing, Brent. Halvorsen's gaze flicked between Paul and Imani. His grip on the clipboard shifted. You think you can intimidate me? No, Imani said. I think I can end this without anyone getting hurt. Which is more than I can say for you, he bristled. End this? You're the one dragging it out. She took another step forward, now close enough that her voice was barely above a whisper. You want to escalate? Fine. But understand that when you put your hand on that gun earlier, you crossed into a territory you're not trained to handle. His eyes narrowed. And you are? Trained to handle you? Yes. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of an air conditioner somewhere down the street. Clarence stepped down another step, tension thick in his voice. Imani. She held up a hand without looking at him. Dad, I've got it. Her calm was unnerving Halvorsen now. She could see it, the twitch of his jaw, the way his weight shifted from one foot to the other. He wasn't used to being read like a book. You're making a mistake, he said finally, voice low. Maybe, she replied. But it won't be mine. That landed. She could tell by the way he looked at her, as if for the first time he realized she wasn't playing the same game he was. Paul broke the moment. I hear sirens, he said. Better make your choice fast, Brent. Halvorsen glanced toward the sound, then back at her. His hand twitched near his side, like he couldn't decide whether to stand down or double down, but before the sirens reached the street, Halvorsen would take one step too far, and Imani's training would take over in a way that left the entire block silent. The sirens were still distant when Halverson's decision came. He stepped forward in a sudden jerky motion, not a full charge, but fast enough to send a jolt through everyone watching. His hand dropped, fingers curling around the grip of his holstered pistol. Vivian gasped. Clarence shouted, "Brent, don't!" Paul took 2 steps closer, his phone still recording. Imani didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Stop! Right now!" But he didn't stop. Maybe he thought she was bluffing. Maybe he thought intimidation would make her back down. Whatever it was, he took one more step toward her, his thumb brushing the holster's release. That was enough. In one smooth motion, Imani closed the distance, her left hand snapping to his wrist, while her right hand pushed down hard on the top of the holster. It was quick, clinical, the kind of move you don't see coming until you're already off balance. She twisted his wrist outward, forcing his elbow to lock, then pivoted her body so his arm was trapped across her torso. "Gun hand's mine," she said evenly, her voice low, but carrying just enough for him, and everyone else, to hear. Halverson tried to yank free, but the pressure on his wrist and the angle of his elbow left him with 2 options: give up or risk a break. He grunted, his clipboard clattering to the asphalt. Vivian's voice wavered. "Imani, I've got it under control," she said without looking away from Halverson. He tried shifting his weight, maybe to shove her off, but she adjusted instantly, pivoting just enough to unclip his sidearm from the holster. The gun came free with a muted click. She stepped back, holding it by the slide, muzzle pointed at the ground. "Step back," she told him, both hands visible. His chest heaved. "You assaulted me!" "No," she corrected. "I stopped you from drawing on an unarmed person in her own driveway. That's called self-defense." Paul moved closer, the camera on his phone steady. "Got all of that," he said. Halverson's face was red now. From anger, from embarrassment, maybe both. "You can't just take my weapon." "I just did," she said. "And you're going to keep your distance until the police get here." The sirens were louder now, the wail bouncing off the houses. 2 neighbors had stepped out onto their lawns, whispering to each other as they took in the scene. Halverson took a step back, then another. "You're done," he spat. "You think your little stunt here means anything?" She kept her eyes on him. "It means everyone here just saw exactly how you handle your authority." Vivian moved to stand beside her daughter, her voice sharp. "Brent, you're finished. You've harassed the wrong person." Clarence came down the driveway, stopping just behind Imani. "I told you earlier. You're making a mistake. Now you've made 2. The SUV's headlights still cut across the driveway, casting long shadows. Imani kept her stance relaxed but ready, the pistol still pointed down, her finger nowhere near the trigger. Then the first patrol car turned onto the street, red and blue lights flashing against the houses. It stopped behind Halverson's SUV, and 2 officers stepped out, hands near their weapons but not drawn. One of them, Officer Ramirez, took in the scene with a quick glance. "What's going on here?" "She took my gun," Halverson blurted. Imani spoke before anyone else could. "I disarmed him after he attempted to draw on me in my parents' driveway without cause." Paul lifted his phone. "It's all on video." Ramirez's partner moved to take the weapon from Imani, and she handed it over without hesitation. "Safety's on," she said. Ramirez looked at Halverson. "You're not law enforcement, you're private security. Why were you drawing your weapon on a resident's family member?" Halverson started to speak, but the words caught. His eyes darted to the small crowd now gathered, neighbors, phones in hand, watching. "This is all a misunderstanding," he said finally. "Doesn't look that way from here," Ramirez replied. "We'll need statements from everyone." Imani exhaled, her muscles finally easing, but her eyes stayed on Halverson. She could see it. The stubborn set of his jaw, the refusal to admit he'd lost control. But losing control in front of the neighbors was one thing. The fallout that came after would hit much harder, and Brent Halverson had no idea how deep this was about to go. The flashing lights painted the street in pulses of red and blue as more police units rolled in, parking along the curb. The air was thick with murmurs from the growing crowd. Kids peeked out from behind their parents' legs. Porch lights flickered on all the way down the block, as if the entire neighborhood had been dragged into the same tense moment. Officer Ramirez began directing people into small clusters to take statements. His partner walked Halverson toward the back of his SUV, keeping him in sight while jotting notes on a pad. Imani stood near her parents, arms crossed, watching the process unfold. She didn't look shaken, not in the way her mother had expected, but there was a stillness about her, like she was saving her energy for what came next. Vivian touched her daughter's arm. "I can't believe this happened here," she said quietly. Imani glanced at her. "It didn't just happen. He made it happen." Clarence stepped forward as Ramirez approached. "We're ready to give our statements," he said, his voice steady but tight. Ramirez nodded. "I'll need to hear from all three of you. And from him." He tilted his head toward Halverson. Paul Whitman stepped in from the side, phone still in hand. "I've got the whole thing on video, start to finish." Ramirez's eyebrows lifted. "That'll help. Email it to me when we're done here." Halverson, standing a few feet away, shot Paul a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Paul didn't look away. "Here's what I saw," Paul began, voice clear enough for nearby neighbors to catch every word. "He blocked her in the driveway, demanded ID, escalated when she didn't comply, and went for his gun. She disarmed him without hurting him. That's it. That's the whole story." Halverson scoffed. "That's your version." Imani finally spoke. "That's the true version, and you know it." A few neighbors murmured in agreement. The pressure of public opinion was shifting right there on the sidewalk. Ramirez held up a hand. "All right, one at a time. I'll need each of your statements separately." While her parents went first, Imani stood at the edge of the driveway, scanning the faces in the crowd. Most were people she recognized from childhood visits, families who had waved from porches, brought casseroles after church, or chatted with her parents at block parties. Now they stood in clusters, shaking their heads, whispering. A woman in a denim jacket approached cautiously. "Imani, I'm Laura Green. I live 2 streets over. I saw him hassling a delivery driver last month. Same attitude. He made the poor guy unload all the boxes in the driveway to prove they were going to the right house." "Did you report it?" Imani asked. Laura shook her head. "Figured it wasn't worth the trouble. But now, I'm thinking maybe we all should have." Imani tucked that detail away. Patterned behavior was easier to challenge than a one-off incident. When it was her turn, Ramirez listened without interrupting as she recounted the timeline. Her tone was clipped, factual, no filler. Years of tactical debriefing had made her precise. "You mentioned you have law enforcement training," Ramirez said when she finished. "That's right," Imani replied. "I'm FBI Tactical Command, assigned to high-risk operations. I'm not here in any official capacity, but I know exactly how wrong his actions were tonight." Ramirez's pen paused mid-word. "That explains the disarm." "It explains why he's lucky I didn't press further," she said. The officer gave a small, tight nod. "We'll file this as an armed threat involving a private security contractor. HOA security or not, he can't operate outside the law." Halverson was leaning against his SUV now, arms crossed, trying to look unfazed. But every so often, his eyes darted toward the small crowd, scanning for allies. He wasn't finding many. Vivian came back from giving her statement, her hands still trembling. "They're going to keep him here while they finish paperwork," she told Imani. "Good," Imani said. "I'll need a copy of the incident report as soon as it's ready." Paul overheard and stepped closer. "You think the HOA's going to try and bury this?" "I think they'll try," Imani said, "but they're not going to succeed." A few feet away, Laura Green was talking to another neighbor, her voice rising just enough for Imani to catch. "If he stays on, I'm taking this to the board myself." The momentum was shifting. What had started as one confrontation in a driveway was beginning to feel like a neighborhood taking inventory of its own tolerance. Officer Ramirez returned after a few minutes. "We'll be contacting the HOA directly. In the meantime, if you feel unsafe, we can arrange for extra patrols." Clarence shook his head. "I think she's the extra patrol we need," he said, glancing at his daughter. That got a couple of chuckles from the bystanders, but Imani's face stayed serious. "This isn't over," she said quietly, mostly to herself. But the next step wasn't about personal safety. It was about pulling back the curtain on how the HOA had been operating. And the picture was uglier than anyone in the neighborhood wanted to admit. The crowd began thinning out once the police pulled away, but a few neighbors lingered, standing in small knots under the yellow glow of streetlights. Conversations carried low, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't the first time Brent Halverson's name had come up in a bad way. Vivian and Clarence led Imani inside, but before she could step through the door, Laura Green caught up to her. "You need to hear this," Laura said, glancing toward the quiet street. "He's been at this for months, not just delivery drivers, teenagers walking home from school, contractors doing yard work, even a grandmother who came to visit her grandkids." Imani closed the door halfway to block the view from outside. "And nobody's taken it to the HOA?" Laura's mouth tightened. "Some have. The board just says they'll look into it, and then it disappears. We think they like having someone who pushes the boundaries, keeps people in line." Clarence let out a humorless laugh. "More like keeps people afraid?" Laura nodded. "Exactly. I've lived here 10 years, and I've never seen neighbors so on edge." From the kitchen, Vivian's voice called out, "Imani, I made coffee. You're going to want it for this conversation." They all moved to the table, the smell of fresh coffee filling the space. Imani sat across from Laura, hands folded. "Give me specifics," she said. Laura took a breath. 2 months ago, a teenage boy, Marcus from down the street, was walking back from basketball practice. Brent stopped him, demanded he empty his gym bag on the sidewalk, said he matched a description. The kid's mom complained to the board. Nothing happened. A week later, she got a notice about her lawn being non-compliant. "That's retaliation," Imani said flatly. "Exactly. And it's not just her. Anyone who pushes back ends up with some petty violation letter. Trash cans left out too long. Fence needs repainting. Stuff they'd never bother with otherwise." Clarence shook his head. "They're using the HOA as a shield." Imani was already thinking in terms of patterns, evidence, leverage. "If there's a history, it's not just about Brent. It's about who's enabling him." Laura leaned in. "That's why we need you. People here are scared to make noise, afraid their property values will tank if they get labeled as difficult residents. But you've got the background to push back." Imani glanced toward her mother. Vivian's expression said she'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "You don't need to convince her," Vivian said to Laura. "Imani doesn't let things like this slide." "I don't," Imani agreed. "But I don't go in blind, either. I need dates, names, details. I need to know how far this board is willing to go to protect him." Laura's eyes lit with something like relief. "I can get that. A few of us keep notes on everything that happens. If I call a meeting, will you come?" "Yes," Imani said without hesitation. "But do it somewhere neutral, not in the neighborhood clubhouse. They'll have someone listening." Clarence sipped his coffee. "You're talking like this is already a case." "It is," Imani said. "Whether it ends up in a board meeting or a courtroom, that's up to them." Vivian reached across the table, her hand warm over her daughter's. "Be careful. This isn't the same as your work with the Bureau. Here, people hold grudges. They talk. They make things personal." Imani gave a small smile. "Mum, I'm counting on that. When people make things personal, they get sloppy." From outside, the sound of an engine idling drifted through the kitchen window. Laura turned her head toward it. "That better not be him." Imani stood, moving to the window. A white sedan sat 2 houses down, headlights off, a silhouette in the driver's seat. Not Halverson's SUV, but it put her on alert. "You think they're watching?" Clarence asked. "I think they want to remind us they're still around," Imani said. Laura's voice was tight. "This is what I mean. It's constant." Imani stepped back from the glass. "Then we document everything. From now on, every conversation, every interaction gets written down or recorded. If they want to play games, we'll make sure they lose on the record." Laura exhaled like she'd been holding that breath for weeks. "I'll start making calls tonight." Vivian slid a plate of cookies toward the middle of the table. "You're going to need these. It's going to be a long week." Imani smiled faintly, but her eyes were already distant, focused on the next steps. But before she could rally the neighbors, the HOA board would make their own move, and it wasn't going to be a meeting request. The first sign that the HOA was moving fast came the next morning, when Clarence opened the mailbox to find a plain white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper stamped "Urgent Notice" in bold red letters. "Property at 412 Brookhaven is in violation of HOA rules." It read, "Failure to address violations will result in fines and potential legal action." Clarence set it on the kitchen counter like it was something toxic. "We've never had a violation in 22 years, he said. Imani picked it up, scanning the lines. The listed infractions were laughable. Improperly stored trash bins, exterior light fixture out of compliance, and unauthorized vehicle in driveway. She set it down slowly. "That last one's me." Vivian's jaw tightened. "So they're starting already?" "They're not just starting," Imani said. "They're sending a message. To us. And to anyone else thinking of speaking up." By mid-morning, her phone rang. It was Laura Green. "You're not going to believe this," Laura said without preamble. "I just got hit with a violation notice too. Something about my front flower bed being non-regulation. I've had the same plants for 8 years." "They're circling the wagons," Imani replied. "Trying to create pressure before we even meet." Laura sighed. "Word is they're holding an emergency board meeting tonight. Closed session." "Perfect," Imani said. "That means they're worried." Meanwhile, Halverson had been seen in the neighborhood that morning, parked at the end of a cul-de-sac, talking to another board member. Word traveled quickly, and by lunch 3 more residents had texted Imani with similar stories of sudden violations. At 3 p.m. she decided to go on offense. She called the HOA's main line and got routed to Janice Robards, the board president. "This is Janice," the voice on the other end said, tight and impatient. "Janice, this is Imani Caldwell. I'm Clarence and Vivian's daughter." A pause. "Yes. I've heard there was an incident last night." "That's one way to put it," Imani said. "Your security contractor threatened me with a firearm in my parents' driveway without cause. I'd like to know what steps you're taking to address that." Janice's voice hardened. "Our security team operates under guidelines set by the board. If there was a misunderstanding, I'm sure it can be resolved without making it bigger than it needs to be." "It's already bigger than you want it to be," Imani replied. "The police have a report. There's video, and I'm aware of at least 6 residents who've had similar encounters with your security." "That's a strong accusation," Janice said, though there was a slight tremor under her words. "It's not an accusation. It's a pattern," Imani said. "And if the board's strategy is to respond with bogus violations, you might want to reconsider. That kind of retaliation has its own legal consequences." Silence on the line for a beat too long. "We'll be in touch," Janice said finally, and hung up. Vivian, who had been listening from the kitchen island, shook her head. "She's rattled." "That's good," Imani said. "People who are rattled make mistakes." By early evening, Laura texted again. "They're meeting at the clubhouse. Looks like half the board showed up in person." Imani grabbed her jacket. "Let's take a walk." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "You planning to crash their meeting?" "No," Imani said. "I'm planning to be seen outside it. Sometimes the best leverage is letting people know you're close enough to hear them panic." They strolled down the sidewalk as the sun dropped low, the clubhouse coming into view. Through the windows a cluster of people sat around a long table, papers and laptops in front of them. Halverson wasn't inside. He was standing out front, arms crossed, scanning the street. When he spotted Imani, his jaw tightened. She didn't break stride, just met his gaze for a brief second before looking past him toward the building. From inside, Janice glanced toward the window and froze when she saw Imani outside. She leaned toward another board member, speaking in low tones. The man's eyes darted toward the glass before looking quickly back down at his notes. Imani and her parents walked slowly past the clubhouse, close enough to catch fragments of raised voices. The word lawsuit floated out into the evening air, followed by contract review and liability. Vivian smiled faintly. "Sounds like they're already talking about cutting him loose." "Maybe," Imani said. "Or maybe they're looking for a way to protect him while throwing someone else under the bus." They kept walking until they were out of sight, then looped back home. The phone was ringing when they stepped inside. Another neighbor, another violation notice, another story of Halverson's behavior. But the real shift wouldn't come from the boardroom. It would come from an investigation that would dig deeper than the HOA ever expected. 2 days later, the knock on the door came just after 9 a.m. Imani was already awake, coffee in hand, reviewing the notes Laura had sent her from years of neighbor complaints. She opened the door to find Officer Ramirez, this time in plain clothes, holding a manila envelope. "Morning," he said. "Got something you're going to want to see." Inside the envelope were photocopies of incident reports, not just from the other night, but from the past year. 12 separate complaints involving Brent Halverson, each one filed with the Plano Police Department. "Most never went anywhere," Ramirez said, stepping into the living room. "Complainants either dropped it after pressure from the HOA, or we were told it was being handled internally. But after your situation, the captain signed off on reviewing every single one." Vivian read over his shoulder. "These are bad. There's one where he stopped a nurse coming home from the night shift and wouldn't let her leave her car until a board member came outside to vouch for her." Clarence frowned. "How's he still working here after all that?" "Because," Ramirez said, "the HOA board kept framing these as misunderstandings or necessary security measures." He tapped the stack. "But this many reports paints a different picture." Imani was quiet for a moment, scanning the language in each report. The phrasing was almost identical. Matched a description, appeared suspicious, refused to comply. "They've been copy-pasting their justification," she said finally. "This isn't just sloppy, it's coordinated." Ramirez nodded. "That's why I'm looping in the city attorney. And you might want to know, the FBI office in Dallas reached out after they saw your name on the report. They're not opening a case yet, but they're watching." Imani set the papers down carefully. "Good, because this isn't just about him anymore. It's about the system that let him operate this way." By noon, the story had started leaking. Someone, Imani suspected Laura, had passed the video to a local news station. The clip ran during the evening broadcast. Grainy phone footage of Halverson blocking her driveway, his hand near his holster, followed by the precise, efficient way she'd disarmed him. The anchors didn't mince words. "A confrontation between an HOA security guard and a visiting FBI tactical commander is sparking questions about private security powers in suburban neighborhoods," one of them read. Vivian's phone rang non-stop that night. Friends, church members, even a cousin in Oklahoma who had seen the segment. Laura called just after the segment aired. "Half the neighborhood's talking about it, the other half's pretending they're not." "And the board?" Imani asked. "They called another closed meeting for tomorrow night," Laura said. "No agenda posted, which means they're scrambling." The next morning, Ramirez called again. "City Attorney's Office wants statements from as many residents as possible. They're opening an inquiry into the HOA's practices. If they find retaliation, that's a civil rights violation." "That's exactly what they've been doing," Imani said. She spent the rest of the day compiling the neighbor accounts Laura had gathered. Patterns emerged quickly. Specific names of board members who backed Halverson, the timing of violation notices, the way certain residents were targeted after disputes. By late afternoon, a black sedan pulled up outside the Caldwell home. 2 people in plain suits stepped out, flashing FBI credentials. "Special Agent Reed," the taller one said, shaking Imani's hand. "We're here in an informal capacity for now. We heard about what happened and wanted to get a sense of the bigger picture." They sat at the kitchen table as Imani laid out the sequence of events, handing over the reports Ramirez had shared, and Laura's compilation of complaints. "This isn't just about one aggressive guard," Agent Reed said after a few minutes. "This looks like a board using a contractor to enforce selective rules. And that's dangerous territory," his partner, Agent Mendez, added. "If we find evidence that they're targeting people based on anything protected under federal law, this could escalate quickly." Imani leaned back in her chair. "Then we make sure you have everything you need." Outside, the neighborhood looked the same. Neatly trimmed lawns, cars parked in driveways, kids on bikes. But inside, the groundwork for a full-scale investigation was being laid. But the real turning point would come not from law enforcement, but from a decision Imani made that night. A decision that would change the neighborhood's balance of power for good. That night, long after Vivian and Clarence had gone to bed, Imani sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp casting a circle of light over her notes. The folder of complaints, the police reports, and the HOA violation letters were spread out like pieces of a puzzle. She'd been trained to see patterns, and here the picture was clear. She could have let the city attorney and the FBI take it from here, but she knew from experience that investigations, especially ones tangled with local politics, could take months or even years to reach a conclusion. Meanwhile, the people living here would still be looking over their shoulders every time they pulled into their driveways. So she made a choice. The next morning, she called Laura. "I'm hosting the meeting tonight," Imani said. "Not in the clubhouse, at my parents' house. Tell everyone who's had a run-in with Brent or gotten one of those bogus violations to come. No reporters, just us." By 7 that evening, the living room was packed. Folding chairs spilled into the hallway. Some faces she recognized, others were strangers who had only ever waved from a distance. But they all had something in common. They'd been on the receiving end of the HOA's version of security. One by one, they spoke. A single mom who'd been followed from the grocery store to her driveway. An elderly man who'd been told his front door looked suspicious because it had been repainted without permission. A contractor who'd been forced to show his driver's license to unload equipment for a job. Imani didn't interrupt. She listened, jotting notes, making sure every account was documented. When the last person finished, she stood, letting her gaze sweep the room. "This," she said, holding up the thick stack of papers, "is enough to put pressure on the board from every angle, legally, financially, publicly, but it only works if we stand together." A murmur of agreement rolled through the room. "They've been counting on you to feel isolated. They've been counting on fear to keep you quiet. That ends tonight. We're not just going to respond to their violations. We're going to file our own. With the city, with law enforcement, and with anyone who will listen." An older woman in the front row raised her hand. "What about retaliation? You know they'll try." Imani nodded. "They might. But we'll document every letter, every phone call, every so-called inspection, and we'll send copies directly to the city attorney's office. If they retaliate, they make our case stronger." Laura spoke up from the back. "I've already got a list going of who's willing to testify if this goes to court." By the end of the night, the mood in the room had shifted. People who'd walked in looking tired and wary were now standing in small groups, exchanging phone numbers, talking strategy. For the first time in months, maybe years, there was a sense of shared resolve. Over the next week, the pressure mounted. Multiple residents filed official complaints. Local media followed up with the HOA for comment, only to be met with no-comment statements. Halverson was quietly removed from his post. The HOA board issued a letter to all residents saying they were reviewing their security protocols. For Imani, the win wasn't just in removing Halverson, it was in watching the neighborhood realize its own strength. One evening, as she and her parents sat on the porch, Clarence handed her a cup of tea. "You know, you could have gone home after the first night and let the system handle it." "I could have," she agreed. "But systems don't change unless someone forces them to, and sometimes that has to start in your own backyard." Vivian smiled, her hand resting on her daughter's. "You gave people their voices back." Imani shook her head. "They already had them. They just needed to be reminded they could use them." From down the street, kids laughed as they rode past on bikes. A neighbor waved. Life looked the same, but Imani knew it wasn't. This wasn't just a story about one guard and one confrontation. It was about standing up to abuse of power, about the courage to act when silence is easier, and about the ripple effect that happens when one person decides enough is enough. If you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't wait for someone else to fix the problem in front of you. Speak up, document, stand together, and when you see wrong, call it what it is, because change doesn't start somewhere else. It starts here. If you believe in standing up for what's right, make sure to subscribe so we can keep telling stories that matter.